The complete story of Elon Musk, from a bullied kid to the world's richest entrepreneur. One man built an electric car company that the entire auto industry said would fail. He built a rocket company that NASA initially refused to take seriously. He helped create an online payment system that changed how the world moves money, co-founded an artificial intelligence lab to prevent a future he feared, and eventually bought one of the most influential communication platforms on the planet. By most measures, he became the richest human being alive. But none of that explains where this story actually begins. It begins with a quiet, awkward boy in South Africa who could barely look people in the eye, who read so many books his parents worried something was wrong with him, and who spent years absorbing more pain than most people experience in a lifetime. To understand the empire, you first have to understand the wound. This is the complete story of Elon Musk, a childhood built on books and bruises. Elon Reeve Musk was born on June 28, 1971, in Pretoria, South Africa, into a household that looked stable from the outside, but was anything but peaceful within. His mother, May Musk, was a model and dietitian, a woman of remarkable resilience who would later raise 3 children largely on her own. His father, Errol Musk, was an engineer, and it was through watching his father work that young Elon first developed a fascination with how things were built. But the relationship between father and son was complicated, marked by years of emotional distance that Musk has described in interviews as deeply painful, shaping a wound he would carry for decades. The marriage between his parents ended in divorce when Elon was around 8 years old, and the fallout split the family in ways that left lasting scars. What made Elon different, even as a small child, was the way he disappeared into books. He wasn't reading the way other children read. He was devouring entire encyclopedias, consuming 10 hours a day at times, absorbing information about physics, engineering, and science fiction with an intensity that worried the adults around him. Teachers and family members thought something might be wrong with his hearing because he would stare blankly into space, completely lost in thought, oblivious to people calling his name. Eventually, doctors discovered the truth. Nothing was wrong with his hearing at all. He was simply somewhere else entirely, lost inside his own mind, running through ideas most adults couldn't begin to follow. That same mind, so powerful and so unusual, made him an easy target. At school, Elon was bullied with a brutality that goes far beyond ordinary childhood teasing. He has spoken about being beaten so severely on one occasion that he ended up hospitalized, his injuries serious enough to require medical attention. Imagine being a child small for your age, socially awkward, more comfortable with books than with people, and being physically thrown down a flight of concrete stairs by classmates who saw your difference as a weakness to exploit. For most children, an experience like that would crush something permanently. For Elon, it became fuel. He has said that those years taught him something brutal but valuable, that the world does not protect the gentle, and that if you want to survive in it, you have to become formidable. It is one of the clearest threads connecting the boy in Pretoria to the man who would later build companies by refusing to accept impossible as an answer. Then came the moment that quietly changed everything. At the age of 10, Elon got his hands on his first computer, a Commodore VIC-20. Most kids that age would have used it to play games. Elon used it to teach himself how to program, working through the manual with an obsessive focus that stunned the people around him. Within 2 years, by the age of 12, he had written and sold a simple video game called Blaster to a computing magazine for around $500. It wasn't just pocket money. It was proof, delivered at 12 years old, that he could build something out of nothing using only his mind and persistence. That single realization that ideas inside his head could become real things in the world would become the engine that drove every company he built for the rest of his life. Leaving South Africa. By the time Elon reached his late teens, he had become convinced of something most people in his position couldn't even imagine, that his future, whatever it was going to be, didn't exist in South Africa. The country's political and economic climate in the 1980s offered limited opportunity, and mandatory military service loomed as an obligation Elon had no desire to fulfill in support of a system he found morally indefensible. So at 17, with very little money and even less certainty, he made a decision that would define his entire trajectory. He left. He moved to Canada, leveraging his mother's Canadian citizenship to gain entry, arriving with little more than a backpack and a stubborn belief that something bigger was waiting for him somewhere else. He took odd jobs to survive, including a grueling stint shoveling grain at a lumber mill, work that was physically exhausting and a world away from the glittering tech empire he would eventually build. But Elon wasn't chasing comfort. He was chasing a doorway into a different kind of life, and that doorway turned out to be Queen's University in Ontario, where he enrolled to study business and physics. It was at Queen's that Elon began to glimpse the scale of ambition that separated him from almost everyone around him. While other students were focused on landing stable jobs after graduation, Elon was already talking about electric cars, solar energy, and space travel. Ideas that sounded almost absurd coming from a broke immigrant student with no money and no connections. Eventually, his academic path led him to the University of Pennsylvania, where he earned dual degrees in physics and economics. That combination wasn't accidental. Physics gave him a framework for understanding how the universe actually works at its most fundamental level, while economics gave him the tools to understand how to build something sustainable around that knowledge. Together, they planted the intellectual roots of what would later become his signature approach to problem solving, stripping every challenge down to its most basic physical truths and building back up from there, a method he would later call first principles thinking. Silicon Valley and the two-day PhD after Pennsylvania, Elon set his sights on Stanford University, enrolling in a PhD program in applied physics and materials science, drawn by the promise of working on cutting-edge energy storage technology. It seemed like the obvious next step for a brilliant, academically gifted young man. And then, astonishingly, he quit after just 2 days. The decision sounds reckless on the surface, but it reveals something essential about how Elon's mind actually worked. This was 1995, and the internet was exploding into public consciousness in real time. Elon looked at the speed of change happening in Silicon Valley and made a calculation. He could spend years completing a PhD, publishing papers, slowly building academic credentials, or he could dive directly into the fastest-moving technological revolution of his generation while it was still wide open. He chose the doorway that was closing fastest. It was a defining moment, the first time Elon demonstrated a pattern that would repeat throughout his career. When a once-in-a-generation opportunity appears, conventional plans become disposable. Zip 2, sleeping on the office floor. With his Stanford plans abandoned, Elon turned to his brother Kimball, and together they founded their first real company, Zip 2, an online city guide that helped newspapers create digital maps and business directories at a time when most companies had no internet presence at all. The idea was sound, but the execution required a level of sacrifice that sounds almost mythical in hindsight. The brothers had no real office in the beginning, just a small rented space and barely any money to live on. Elon slept on the office floor most nights, showering at a local YMCA because they couldn't afford an apartment. He coded around the clock, often pulling all-night sessions fueled by nothing but determination and the gnawing fear of failure. There was no safety net. If Zip 2 collapsed, there was no trust fund waiting to catch him. This period forged something permanent in Elon's psychology. The belief that extreme effort, the kind that most people consider unreasonable or even unhealthy, was simply the entry price for building something meaningful. It's a belief that would later define the brutal work culture inside Tesla and SpaceX factories. As Zip 2 grew, outside investors came in, and with them came boardroom politics that Elon found suffocating. He wanted to be CEO, convinced he understood the product and the vision better than anyone else. But the board disagreed, eventually installing someone else in the role. It was Elon's first taste of losing control over something he had built with his own hands, and it stung. Still, the company found its market, and in 1999, Compaq acquired Zip 2 for roughly $307 million in cash. Elon's share came to around $22 million. He was not yet 30 years old, and he was suddenly undeniably wealthy. But instead of retreating into comfort, he immediately poured $10 million of that fortune into his next venture, a decision that revealed exactly what kind of entrepreneur he intended to become. X.com, PayPal, and the painful exit. The idea behind his next company sounded borderline insane to most people who heard it. Elon wanted to build a complete online bank, X.com, a platform that would let people send money to each other instantly over the internet, something that simply did not exist in any reliable form in 1999. Banks were slow, paperwork-driven institutions, and the notion that ordinary people would trust their money to a website struck most observers as naive at best. X.com eventually merged with a rival company called Confinity, whose product, a peer-to-peer payment tool, would become known as PayPal. The merger created enormous internal tension. Two strong-willed engineering cultures were suddenly forced to share one company, and disagreements over technical direction and business strategy escalated quickly. In 2000, while Elon was on his honeymoon, the company's board moved against him, voting to remove him as CEO in his absence. It was a gut punch on a scale most entrepreneurs never recover from, watching a company he had built and fought for slip out of his hands while he wasn't even in the room. Yet Elon stayed involved as the company's largest shareholder, watching from the sidelines as PayPal rapidly became the dominant force in online payments. In 2002, eBay acquired PayPal for $1.5 billion in stock, and Elon's stake delivered him roughly $180 million. On paper, it was an extraordinary financial victory, but the lesson Elon took from it ran far deeper than the money. Losing control of PayPal taught him that he never again wanted to build something he believed in only to have it taken from him by people with less conviction. From that point forward, in every company he would go on to build, Elon fought relentlessly to retain control, often at significant personal financial risk, because he had learned firsthand what it felt like to lose the wheel. The decision that changed everything. By 2002, Elon Musk was financially set for life. He could have stopped. He could have spent the rest of his days as a wealthy Silicon Valley investor, comfortable and largely anonymous. Instead, he did something almost nobody in his position would do. He took nearly all of that fortune and put it directly back on the line, splitting it across two industries that conventional wisdom said were essentially impossible for a private individual to break into: rockets and cars. It's worth pausing to understand why. Elon has explained his philosophy in interviews many times, framing his approach around solving civilization-scale problems rather than simply chasing financial returns. He believed that humanity's long-term survival depended on becoming a multiplanetary species, and he believed that the world's addiction to fossil fuels was an existential threat that needed an urgent technological answer. Most people who reach financial independence look for safety. Elon looked for the two riskiest, most capital-intensive, most failure-prone industries imaginable and walked directly toward them. It was either the most reckless decision of his life or the most visionary one. History was about to decide which. SpaceX, building rockets from nothing. The origin of SpaceX traces back to a trip Elon took to Russia in 2001, where he hoped to purchase refurbished intercontinental ballistic missiles that could be converted into rockets capable of sending a greenhouse experiment to Mars, part of a project meant to reignite public excitement about space exploration. The Russians, however, treated the young American with thinly veiled contempt, quoting him absurd prices and at one point spitting near his feet during negotiations. Elon walked away from those meetings humiliated but newly convinced of something important. If existing players wouldn't sell him affordable rockets, he would simply build his own. The aerospace industry's collective reaction to this idea ranged from amusement to outright mockery. Building rockets was considered the exclusive domain of governments and a handful of massive defense contractors, an industry with such staggering technical and financial barriers that no private individual had ever successfully built a company capable of reaching orbit. Elon founded SpaceX in 2002 anyway, hiring a small team of brilliant engineers and setting an almost impossibly ambitious goal of dramatically lowering the cost of access to space. What followed were 3 consecutive launch failures of the company's Falcon 1 rocket, each one a devastating public humiliation, watched by an aerospace industry that increasingly viewed SpaceX as a vanity project doomed to collapse. Each failure burned through cash the company desperately needed. By 2008, after the third failed launch, SpaceX was down to its final attempt, with funds so depleted that another failure would almost certainly mean the end of the company entirely. Engineers worked around the clock under unbearable pressure, fully aware that the next launch wasn't just a test, it was survival itself. On September 28, 2008, Falcon 1 finally reached orbit successfully, becoming the first privately developed liquid-fueled rocket ever to do so. It is difficult to overstate what that moment meant inside SpaceX. Years of public ridicule, 3 catastrophic failures, and a company balanced on the edge of bankruptcy were suddenly validated in a matter of minutes. Shortly afterward, NASA awarded SpaceX a contract worth roughly $1.6 billion to fly cargo resupply missions to the International Space Station, a deal that didn't just save the company financially, it legitimized it in the eyes of the entire aerospace establishment. From that foundation, SpaceX went on to accomplish things that once sounded like science fiction. The company developed reusable rocket boosters that could land themselves vertically after launch, slashing the cost of spaceflight in ways that fundamentally rewired the economics of the entire industry. It built Starship, the largest and most powerful rocket ever constructed, designed explicitly with Mars colonization in mind. And it built Starlink, a constellation of satellites delivering internet access to remote corners of the planet that traditional infrastructure had never been able to reach. reach. The boy who once got humiliated by Russian arms dealers had built from scratch the most advanced rocket company on Earth, Tesla, betting against Detroit. Tesla's story is often misunderstood, so it's worth setting the record straight. Elon Musk did not originally found Tesla Motors. The company was started in 2003 by engineers Martin Eberhard and Mark Tarpenning, built around the conviction that electric cars could be both fast and genuinely desirable rather than slow, ugly compromises. Elon joined in 2004, leading a major funding round and becoming chairman of the board, immersing himself deeply in the company's product and engineering direction from very early on. Over the following years, as internal conflicts and financial pressures mounted, Elon's role expanded steadily until he formally became CEO in 2008, a title he has held ever since. The skepticism Tesla faced from the established auto industry was almost universal. Legacy automakers, comfortable with a century of internal combustion dominance, viewed electric vehicles as a niche curiosity destined to remain on the margins, plagued by limited range, painfully long charging times, and consumer indifference. Tesla's early Roadster, while expensive and limited in production, proved that an electric car could be genuinely thrilling to drive. The Model S that followed shattered expectations entirely, delivering luxury, blistering acceleration, and real-world range that finally made electric vehicles viable for everyday life. The Model 3, launched years later, brought that same technology to a price point accessible to ordinary buyers, triggering a wave of pre-orders that overwhelmed even Tesla's own expectations. Behind the scenes, Tesla pursued an audacious vertical integration strategy, building massive gigafactories to manufacture batteries at a scale the industry had never attempted, while simultaneously developing Autopilot, a suite of driver assistance technology aimed at advancing toward full autonomy. Traditional automakers underestimated Tesla for years, dismissing it as a niche player propped up by government subsidies, right up until the company's market valuation eventually surpassed that of nearly every legacy automaker combined. By then it was clear that Tesla hadn't just built an electric car company, it had forced an entire global industry to fundamentally rethink its future. 2008, the year everything almost collapsed. If there is one year that defines the razor's edge, Elon Musk walked to build his empire, it is 2008. The global financial crisis was tearing through markets worldwide. Credit had frozen solid, and capital for risky ventures had essentially evaporated. Both of Elon's companies were simultaneously in mortal danger. SpaceX had just suffered its third consecutive rocket failure and was nearly out of cash. Tesla was bleeding money at an alarming rate, struggling to get the Model S into production, while investors grew increasingly nervous about ever seeing a return. At the same time, Elon's personal life was falling apart. His marriage to his first wife, Justine, was ending in divorce, adding a layer of personal devastation to a year already defined by professional catastrophe. By Elon's own account, this period brought him closer to total ruin than at any other point in his life. He was reportedly down to his last funds, personally lending money to keep both companies alive simultaneously, essentially betting his entire remaining net worth on two ventures that the rest of the world had already written off as failures. There was no cushion left. One more failure on either side would have ended everything. And then, almost impossibly, both companies pulled back from the brink within weeks of each other. SpaceX's fourth Falcon 1 launch succeeded in late September, leading directly to that life-saving NASA contract. Just months later, in December of 2008, Tesla closed a critical round of funding that kept the company alive long enough to bring the Model S to market. The timing was so narrow, so improbable, that Elon has described it as feeling like watching two separate companies dodge bankruptcy by mere days. The psychological toll of that year never fully left him, but it also forged an unshakable belief that near-total collapse was survivable, a conviction that would embolden every massive risk he took afterward. Building the energy ecosystem, Solar City. While Tesla and SpaceX were clawing their way back from the edge, Elon was already thinking about the next piece of a much larger puzzle. In 2006, he helped conceive Solar City, a company founded by his cousins Lyndon and Peter Reeve, aimed at making residential solar power accessible and affordable for ordinary homeowners, rather than a luxury reserved for the wealthy. The vision extended naturally from Tesla's mission. It wasn't enough to build electric cars if the electricity charging them still came from fossil fuels. Solar City, paired later with Tesla's Powerwall home battery system, was meant to close that loop entirely, allowing households to generate clean energy during the day, store it, and use it whenever needed. In 2016, Tesla acquired Solar City outright, folding solar and battery storage directly into its broader mission of accelerating the world's transition to sustainable energy. Hyperloop, an idea given away. In 2013, Elon published a detailed concept for an entirely new mode of transportation he called the Hyperloop, a system that would propel passenger pods through low-pressure tubes at speeds rivaling commercial aircraft, all at a fraction of the cost of traditional high-speed rail. What made this moment unusual was was that Elon, already stretched thin, running two demanding companies, chose not to build Hyperloop himself. Instead, he released the concept publicly as an open-source idea, inviting other entrepreneurs and engineers to take it forward. It was a rare glimpse into a different side of his ambition, less about personal empire building and more about seeding ideas he believed the world needed, even if he wasn't the one to execute them. OpenAI, fighting a fear from the inside. Elon's relationship with artificial intelligence has always carried an undercurrent of genuine fear. He has spoken repeatedly about the existential risk posed by advanced AI systems developed without sufficient safety precautions, comparing the stakes to summoning a power humanity might not be able to control. In 2015, motivated by these concerns, he co-founded OpenAI alongside Sam Altman and several other researchers, establishing it initially as a nonprofit dedicated to ensuring artificial general intelligence would be developed safely and for the benefit of humanity broadly, rather than concentrated in the hands of a single corporation. Elon's direct involvement with OpenAI didn't last. In 2018, he departed from the organization's board, citing disagreements over its direction and potential conflicts with Tesla's own growing work on AI for autonomous driving. As OpenAI evolved in the years that followed, transitioning toward a more commercially structured model and achieving extraordinary success with products that captured global attention, Elon became an increasingly vocal critic, arguing the organization had drifted from the founding mission he had originally championed. Neuralink, merging mind and machine. In 2016, Elon co-founded Neuralink, a company pursuing one of the most ambitious and unsettling frontiers in technology, a direct interface between the human brain and computers. The mission centers on developing implantable devices capable of reading and potentially writing neural signals, with near-term goals focused on helping people with severe paralysis regain the ability to communicate and control devices using thought alone. Longer term, Elon has spoken about a future where brain-computer interfaces could help humanity keep pace with increasingly powerful artificial intelligence, preventing a scenario where AI vastly outstrips unaugmented human cognition. The technical and ethical challenges involved are immense, and Neuralink has faced significant scrutiny over its animal testing practices and the safety risks inherent in implanting devices directly into human brain tissue. Even so, the company has continued advancing toward human trials, chasing a vision that sounds more like science fiction than contemporary medicine. The Boring Company, digging beneath the problem. Born partly out of Elon's own frustration sitting in Los Angeles traffic, the Boring Company emerged in 2016 around a deceptively simple idea. If cities couldn't expand outward or upward fast enough to solve congestion, why not build downward instead? The company set out to dramatically reduce the cost and time required to dig underground tunnels, envisioning a network of high-speed underground routes that could move vehicles beneath gridlocked city streets. Its most visible project to date, the Las Vegas Loop, ferries passengers through underground tunnels beneath the Las Vegas Convention Center, a working proof of concept for a much larger ambition that remains for now only partially realized. Twitter becomes X. In April 2022, Elon Musk stunned the business world by announcing a bid to purchase Twitter, eventually completing the acquisition that October for $44 billion. His stated motivations centered on concerns about free speech and content moderation on the platform, along with a broader vision of transforming Twitter into what he described as an everything app, combining messaging, payments, and content into a single unified platform similar to apps already popular in parts of Asia. The transition was brutal and immediate. Elon moved swiftly to cut roughly 75% of the company's workforce, a decision that triggered intense backlash from former employees, advertisers, and media commentators who questioned whether the platform could function at all with such a dramatically reduced team. He rebranded the company entirely, retiring the iconic Twitter name and bird logo in favor of a single letter, X, signaling his intention to build something far more expansive than a social media platform alone. The acquisition remains one of the most polarizing decisions of his career, praised by supporters as a necessary disruption of stagnant corporate culture and condemned by critics as reckless and destabilizing. Whatever the final verdict, it cemented Elon's role not just as a builder of companies, but as a direct participant in some of the most contentious cultural and political debates of his era. XAI, racing the future he helped create. In 2023, having grown disillusioned with OpenAI's trajectory, Elon founded XAI, a new artificial intelligence company built around developing his own large language models and AI systems, positioning itself as a direct competitor to the very very organization he had helped create nearly a decade earlier. The mission Elon has articulated for XAI centers on what he calls understanding the true nature of the universe, framing the company's purpose in almost philosophical terms rather than purely commercial ones. It represents something deeply characteristic of Elon's career. Rather than stepping back from a technology he feared, he chose to build inside it, betting that direct involvement gave him a better chance of shaping its outcome than staying on the sidelines ever could. Inside the mind of a first principles thinker, across every company Elon has built, certain patterns repeat with remarkable consistency. He approaches problems through what he calls first principles thinking, stripping every assumption down to its most basic physical truths and rebuilding solutions from that foundation, rather than simply following industry convention. This is the same mental framework that allowed him to look at the price of rocket components and conclude that the raw materials cost a fraction of what aerospace contractors were charging, revealing enormous room for innovation that everyone else had simply accepted as fixed. His work ethic borders on the extreme by almost any standard. He has described sleeping on factory floors during critical production crunches at Tesla, working 100-hour weeks to push the Model 3 through what he called production hell. His management style is famously hands-on, often described as micromanagement, with Elon directly involved in granular engineering decisions that most CEOs at his level would delegate entirely. His hiring philosophy prioritizes raw problem-solving ability and demonstrated passion over traditional credentials. And he has openly stated a preference for hiring people who have overcome significant obstacles, believing that struggle builds the kind of resilience his companies demand. Above all, his tolerance for risk remains almost unmatched among modern entrepreneurs, a willingness to bet enormous sums and entire companies on ideas that conventional business wisdom would dismiss outright. Criticism and controversy. No honest account of Elon Musk's story can ignore the substantial criticism that has followed him throughout his career. Former employees and labor organizations have raised serious concerns about working conditions inside Tesla and SpaceX facilities, describing relentless pressure, long hours, and a culture that some have characterized as punishing. His leadership style, while effective at driving rapid innovation, has also been criticized as erratic and unpredictable, with abrupt decisions that have at times rattled investors and employees alike. His presence on social media has generated significant controversy as well, with critics arguing that his public statements have spread misinformation or inflamed contentious debates, while supporters counter that he is simply exercising the same free expression he advocates for broadly. His increasing political involvement in recent years, including public alignment with specific political figures and causes, has further polarized public perception, drawing both passionate support and intense criticism in roughly equal measure. These controversies do not exist separately from his business achievements. They are woven into the same complicated portrait of a man whose ambition and influence have grown large enough to reshape industries, and whose every public move now carries consequences far beyond the companies he runs. A legacy still being written. Stepping back from the individual companies, the cumulative impact of Elon Musk's career is difficult to overstate. He played a central role in pushing electric vehicles from a niche curiosity into a mainstream global industry, forcing automakers worldwide to fundamentally rethink their future. He built the first private company capable of sending humans to orbit, fundamentally altering the economics of spaceflight and reigniting public ambition for Mars exploration. His ventures into artificial intelligence, brain-computer interfaces, underground transportation, and global satellite internet have touched nearly every major frontier of contemporary technology simultaneously, an almost unprecedented breadth of influence for a single individual. Whether every one of these bets ultimately succeeds is still an open question, and that uncertainty is part of what makes this story so compelling to watch unfold in real time. Mars colonization remains decades away at best. Brain-computer interfaces remain in their infancy. The long-term consequences of his AI ventures and of his ownership of X are still being written. This is not a finished biography. It is a story still very much in progress. You're closing from a bullied, bookish kid in Pretoria who got thrown down a flight of stairs by classmates, to a young immigrant sleeping on an office floor to build his first company, to a man who has personally reshaped how the world drives, how it reaches space, and how it communicates. Elon Musk's journey defies almost every conventional template of success. Whether history ultimately remembers him as the greatest entrepreneur of his generation, the most controversial innovator of our time, or something more complicated than either label can capture, one thing remains undeniable. He changed the future before most people even realized it was coming. If this story captivated you, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the world's most fascinating entrepreneurs. Hit the like button if you made it all the way to the end, and drop a comment below telling us which part of Elon Musk's journey surprised you the most.